Hello and welcome to Kentucky History. This is History 240 and we are on Chapter 2 and it is called The Invasion of Kentucky, I believe. Yes, The Invasion of Kentucky. So I will be going over Chapter 3 with you. And I want to start this out with talking about slavery because it does involve the Native Americans as well. So let's take this into our camera shot, hopefully. First of all, I want to, it's still not really in there, is it? Is that better? This is supposed to be the U.S. Sorry, it's a little rough. Oh, I need to take my shade off. Sorry, so that you can see my face. There we go. That's a little bit. It's a little bit brighter. Okay, so we need to talk about why slavery in the United States is very different than any other slavery in the whole world, okay? And we are really feeling the repercussions of that right now because it is so very different that it's sad. Okay, first of all, the time, about 400 years, okay? Second, the magnitude, 8 million African slaves taken against their will, okay? And if you give me the argument, oh, well, you know, tribes sold each other, they sold their own people, they did not know the magnitude of what was going to happen in any way, shape, or form, okay? So you need to just stop that argument and throw it away, okay? Because they didn't know that they were taking them across the sea and just how inhumane it was, okay? So we're going to talk about it. So the first set of slaves that came over, or they were kind of bought and sold for like 7 years. You've probably heard of them, indentured servants. They were Europeans, young European women and men, like ages, 18 to 30-ish. Somebody would buy your passage and then you would come across, and for 7 years you would work for someone. Women were sent across the ocean without fathers and brothers to protect them. Okay, a lot of them had issues, maybe raped, harassed, or they got into relationships with other young men because they're young, right? And many times the Puritans, oh geez, the Puritans, yikes, yikes. They would actually whip pregnant women, okay? Yeah. Quakers were a much more loving, they were more over in this area, but Quakers were much more loving. Of course, they didn't want you to, have sex outside of marriage and that sort of thing, but they did not whip pregnant women. That's just a little rough. But if there was something wrong, like if a servant, I'm sorry, if an indentured servant was beaten or something horrible was happening to them, or raped or whatever, they could actually run to a church, and seek some shelter and try and get away from it. Okay, there was hope. Okay. So then they realized that this was really not working, so they decided to start enslaving Native Americans. Now we need to talk about the pattern of colonialism for a minute. So the pattern of colonialism, especially in Africa, was this. Different European countries would make friends with different, tribes and trade with them. Then they would take them over. Then they would make their people slaves. Then they would take every single natural resource from their country and leave them poor, destitute, desolate. All right. Funny thing is, 13 American colonies knew this. So you're going to read in your book how Great Britain, the French and Indian War, they were like, excuse me, colonists, you're going to pay for the French and Indian War. It's all your fault. So we're going to put all these taxes upon you. And then, you have the revolution. They were Europeans. They knew what they were going to do. So they actually stopped them. Isn't that amazing? But these other countries, when a country came in and said, hey, let's be friends, they're like, oh, okay, this is like a real peace treaty. No. Then, they would take over, they would enslave their people, they would take all their gold. It's funny, Ethiopia is one of the poorest countries in the world and it had tons of gold. You know where it is? Not in Ethiopia anymore. It's a pattern. Colonialism is a horrible thing. They come in and they say, hey, we want to make you Christians and we want to do good for you. We want to do all this wonderful stuff. And it's not true at all. They just want to, it's just greed. The greed rolls, the greed sucks them dry. That's history. Study it. All right, so the patterns of colonialism. So Native Americans were taken as slaves. It didn't work very well because even though they fought each other, you know, the Cherokee hated the Iroquois hated everybody, the Shawnee hated the Iroquois. But this is the thing. If you're a Shawnee and you're taken as a slave and you're beaten or you're raped or you're treated poorly, you can escape and run and go to a different tribe. The Iroquois knew how the Europeans treated Native Americans. And they were like, listen, you were our arch enemy as a Cherokee, but we get it. So come on in. We will take care of you. We will hide you. We'll get you away from this abuse. Okay. This is what's really sad. Also, you need to know in Native American culture, which is my favorite, one of my favorite cultures. If I had anyone anywhere to live in the 1800s, it would be with Native Americans because they treated women better. There just was a lot more equality. It was much more balanced, matriarchy, patriarchy together. So anyway, Native Americans, if you were a slave, your children were never born into slavery. No child was ever born into slavery. And that was like a rule. And that's also in world history too. A lot of times you could pay your way out. A lot of times your children would get out, okay? So there's just a dark and dismal negative cloud over slavery that you need to understand because we're going to start hitting a bunch of this and you need to understand the basis of it. Okay. All right. So we bring, 8 million Africans over. They don't know the language. We only have one surviving account of an African slave talking about the slave ship because we didn't teach. It was illegal to teach your slave to read because, good golly, what if they wrote about their life? Can you imagine? Very, very few accounts because, 33% of, female slaves were raped by their masters or their masters' sons. It was just an absolute disaster nightmare. All right, so they bring over the Africans. They're marked by their skin color, okay? They can't really speak English right away. They're not taught to read or write. There's no hope. There's so much death. Babies were always born into slavery. If there was one drop of your blood, if there was one drop of black blood, you were considered a slave, which is so not logical, right? Because this is a patriarchy. So if your dad, which, oh, geez, you look at who is, the father of many of these slaves were the slave masters, and they're supposed to be good Christian men not having sex with their slaves. Holy moly, right? And it's a patriarchy, so it's supposed to go through the father's line, except if the mother is a slave. So it doesn't make any sense, right? If it's a true patriarchy, it just was convenient. It was convenient to them. There was no mercy. If you were sent to the South and you had to do like sugarcane fields or you had to do the cotton fields, you were usually dead within 3 years, okay? If you were a slave in Kentucky, you had a much better chance of living, a little more freedom because they were worried about you crossing the Ohio River. Still wasn't great. You're still owned by another human. There was no marriage. Marriage was illegal. This is supposed to be a Christian nation. They wouldn't let slaves get married. Okay, so slaves married anyway. It was a form of rebellion. Building a family and marriage was like a form of rebellion. Isn't that beautiful? I'm sorry, I'm such a romantic. But this is a sad thing. They were ripped away from their families and often sold, even if a slave master was, kind, which if he was really kind, he'd let them go. If a slave master was kind, he would, allow them to be together as long as possible. But then if he had a financial, something terrible happen, he'd have to sell them. Most slaves lost their spouse because they were sold and were married almost 3 times. Not because they wanted to, not because they like that was stability to them in a chaotic, horrific world of being owned. Okay, it's really sad. Many women will look into some of them. I have one of them on my Sojourner of Truth is like my hero, and we'll watch a little video of her this week probably. She, I believe, lost 13 to 15 children that she never saw again. Okay, so we're talking some real heartache and no hope. Okay, for 400 years, by the way. 400 years, 8 million. And you have to understand 98% of all African Americans today in the United States, their ancestors were brought here against their will. 98%. Okay. That has a lot of trauma on a family. And I don't know if you've ever read the book by Toni Morrison. I would definitely suggest it. It's called Beloved, and it just talks about the trauma from living in such a violent, whipping, raping, just terrible slave society as an African American slave, and what that does to your family. Such violence, what it would do to any family. So I just want you to understand that the United States slavery is very, very, very different and brutal. And world slavery throughout the world is just very different. Okay. And I wanted you to be able to understand that. And we'll go over that some more. All right.